Well, it's a distinctive feature of Facebook Live that all Facebook Live events begin with a kind of panic, which this one just did, as we couldn't get my laptop camera to work. But if all is going well, I should now be live on Facebook, which is a little bit ironic, as I've spent quite a lot of the last few weeks criticizing Facebook. At any event, the name of the game this evening is to talk to you, readers of The Square and the Tower and other books I've written, and to answer some of your questions. I already have a few here. One that came through, which I rather liked, was, what are your thoughts on the network of the network owners in tech? This is a great question because, of course, it goes to the heart of Silicon Valley's peculiar culture. Officially, the internet's this wonderful horizontal democratic platform on which we're all netizens, equally empowered to speak truth to power. In practice, the internet is, to a large extent, owned, and the platforms that run on it, in particular, are owned by a remarkably small number of people, founders of companies like Amazon, Google, and Facebook. And as I've come to realize since I moved from Harvard to Stanford, there is a network within the network. It's an incredibly powerful network. It has a whole cluster of important nodes in Sand Hill Road. And in some ways, it's become the most powerful network in the world. On the other hand, and this is a point that I didn't fully understand until I spent some time here, the key tech companies compete with one another extraordinarily fiercely. So this isn't one of these cozy networks in which everybody is buddies with everybody else. It's a network which has quite a lot of tension within it. Think Uber v. Waymo. So that's one question that caught my attention. I'm assuming that anybody tuning in, and I'm glad to see some people have joined, has either read the book or is thinking of buying the book. And so I'm going to tackle a bunch of different questions that have already come in. Somebody says, I barely hear you. Technical support. I wonder if we can do anything about that. So let's see if we can boost the volume. I can also shout. One of the advantages of coming from Glasgow is that yelling comes pretty naturally to me. A question was asked about Bitcoin by Nivas Sivaprakasam. Will Bitcoin survive beyond all these market predictions that go against it? My instinct is that it will. Last year, there was a classic bubble, and in my capacity as a financial historian, I certainly wasn't surprised to see that bubble burst. But I don't expect Bitcoin to disappear, and I don't expect it to go to zero. I think there's a great deal of confusion about what exactly cryptocurrencies are. I sometimes think they're neither crypto nor currencies. I don't think Bitcoin is going to become money. And I think it's a misunderstanding to think that Bitcoin is potentially a substitute for the dollar or any other currency. Bitcoin is a speculative object. That's an important role to have in financial markets. It was especially important last year when every other financial market had almost zero volatility. Bitcoin was a thing you could speculate in. And Bitcoin is also a store of value of a kind. It's an appealing store of value if you're a high net worth individual in a country whose rule of law and property rights protection are weak. So if you ask yourself the question, what if every millionaire in the world decided to hold just 1%
of his or her wealth in the form of Bitcoin, then the price of Bitcoin would be a lot higher than it is right now. I think Bitcoin sticks around at least in those two roles as speculative object and an alternative store of value, a digital gold, if you will. What's the right price? I have to say that I somewhat rashly said to a few friends last year that $10,000 would be an entry point, and I dutifully entered and have lost money on that trade. Maybe 5 was the right answer. The truth is that anybody who's buying Bitcoin right now is not likely to make money in the short run, but the history of Bitcoin over 10 years has been one of recurrent bubbles and busts, but never complete destruction, and over the long run, an appreciation. So yeah, I think it's not a zero. Another question, will the upcoming stock market crash be the same time when the prices of the cryptocurrencies shoot up to the moon? No. I think what we're seeing, first of all, in the stock market is the return of normal volatility. That was predictable. In fact, I wrote a bit about this back in mid-November, because with monetary policy normalization, the end of quantitative easing, the hiking of rates by the Federal Reserve, you were ending a period of repressed or suppressed volatility. I think quantitative easing was a kind of volatility suppressant. As you come off the meds, you return to more normal volatility. I don't think one should think of this really as a stock market crash. We've just lost that spike that we saw in January and returned to where we were roughly when I wrote that column on, when was it, November the 19th. So that's not a crash. It's only really a correction if you regard what happened in January as a meaningful rally. I think we're returning to normal volatility on stocks rather than edging towards some protracted decline. As for the cryptocurrencies, I don't think it really affects them one way or another. It's a completely different asset class. I think the big issue for cryptocurrencies is that there's going to be increasing regulatory pressure, and a lot of the ICOs, a lot of the initial coin offerings are going to turn out to have been fraudulent. It's going to be a succession of ugly stories, and there will be some zeros out there. Some of these currencies will turn out to be bogus. So no, I don't think there's a connection between what's going on in the stock market and what's going on in crypto. Let's see. Questions are coming in now. I'm seeing a question from Arthur Hutchinson, who's asked, off topic, but you called the USA a reluctant imperialist in Colossus. What's changed since the book debuted, which Arthur was back in 2004, I think. So it's been 14 years since I wrote that book. Colossus is a book that's often cited by people who haven't read it. This is a phenomenon of our times. The idea that Colossus was an apologia for imperialism is absurd. What Colossus actually argued was that the United States would not do a good job of being an imperialist if that was, in fact, what was happening in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it was best understood as an empire in denial. And the reason I thought that it would do badly with those undertakings back then was, number one, the manpower deficit. That's to say, Americans don't really want to go and live in hot, poor, dangerous countries. Most US service personnel and civilians rotate out of war zones after relatively short periods. Well, that's certainly not how you build up local expertise. I also pointed out back in 2004 that the fiscal deficit would be a constraint on America's empire building projects. That's a problem that has, of course, only got worse since I wrote the book. But the main argument in the book was that there was an attention deficit. So there were 3 deficits, of which the most important was the attention deficit. And the prediction of the book was that within around 4 years, Americans would lose their enthusiasm for nation building if they ever had much. And that was truly what happened. So that by the time of the financial crisis, 2008, 4 years after I'd written the book, the mood had turned sour on Iraq. People had largely forgotten about Afghanistan. And Barack Obama was able to get elected partly on the strength of having not been in favor of the invasion of Iraq. I looked at the book recently. It's always a little strange to go back to these books after many years. And I was pleasantly surprised by how much of it still stood up. So I think the basic analytical framework about what was weak about the United States, even in that period of super self-confidence in the early years of George W. Bush, I think much of that still rings true. Turning to other questions, Simon Fury asks, do you believe Trump's Asia-Pacific engagement strategy is a continuation of Obama's Asia pivot or something entirely different? Great question, Simon. It's something entirely different. It's hard to characterize both of the things you refer to. The pivot to Asia, which President Obama talks about, became something of a joke in Beijing because it wasn't clear that it meant anything terribly much in the Far East. It really was shorthand for get the heck out of the Middle East. So it was really a pivot away from the Middle East, and that took the form of not intervening in any effective way in the Syrian civil war, with pretty disastrous consequences, I would argue, and then attempting, but I think not very effectively, to work out a strategy towards China that would strike a balance between cooperation and containment. And if you look back on the national security strategies published in the Obama presidency, they're quite mealy-mouthed about China. By contrast, President Trump has used pretty combative language towards China. He did it on the campaign trail, and he still does it periodically. The national security strategy that was published in December is remarkably hard-hitting on China. It explicitly identifies it as a rival along with Russia, and uses some pretty tough talk on a whole range of issues, naval issues, as well as issues of intellectual property rights. So this is a very different approach, at least in language, at least on paper. In practice last year, Trump blew hot and cold. He seemed to want to play hardball in the early phase of the administration. He took a call from the Taiwanese government, which caused consternation in Beijing. But when he met Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago, they were besties without much time being wasted. And when Trump went on his Asia trip, the Chinese, I think, formed the opinion that they could flatter him and boost his ego and get away without really facing any meaningful pressure from the US. 2018 could be different. We've already seen some moves in trade that have suggested a more muscular American stance. But the big unanswered question is what is going to happen about North Korea? On North Korea, the Obama administration did extremely badly, did nothing really to slow down the North Korean nuclear arms program. If anything, speeded it up. And the Trump administration has talked a great deal tougher on this issue. We don't know just how far this is going to go. The attempt has been to lean on China, to try to get China to lean on the North Koreans. It hasn't really worked. So I can't give a definitive answer about Trump's China policy. It is too early to tell. Let me see, what else have we got in the feed? There's a question from Dustin Stewart. Should the big four tech firms get broken up? Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook. Scott Galloway has a piece, professor at New York University who knows a lot about tech issues, in the latest issue of Esquire, which addresses this question and answers it in the affirmative. He's been arguing for some time that the big four have got too powerful and that the only way forward is to break them up. I like Galloway's style and I like the piece. In fact, I tweeted it out today saying it was the must-read of the weekend. I'm not sure I'm convinced that it's going to happen, though. And here's why. Antitrust as a weapon is not a sharp weapon against the big tech companies, because traditional interpretations of antitrust since the 1960s in the US have tended to emphasize the question, is the consumer hurt by the monopoly? I don't think it's going to be at all easy for anybody to show that the consumer has been hurt by Amazon, or for that matter by Facebook. The tech companies, I think, have a pretty strong defense against antitrust unless we radically rethink antitrust and go back to an earlier iteration, back to the days when it could be used against companies that engaged in anti-competitive practices towards rivals. So Standard Oil was broken up back in the day, not really because consumers were being hurt, but because of the way that Standard Oil was hurting any meaningful competition. I don't know whether it will be possible to rethink antitrust or go back in time with antitrust. I also think you have to bear in mind that the tech companies are very, very politically powerful now through the channel of money and politics. Yep, I'm afraid so. They've been lobbying like nobody's business in Washington for years. And that makes a difference because it makes it very hard to move the dial on regulation and on legislation if you have a great many people on the payroll in the swamp. So I think the short answer to the question is, even if you think it's right, as Scott Galloway argues, it's not going to happen. You could also argue that it's not even right because there are natural monopolies in network markets. Zipf's law applies in these markets. The winner gets 90%, the runner-up gets 9%, and everybody else gets 0.9%. And it's pretty hard to do anything about that because you can't really imagine a world in which Facebook has some rival, MySpace, with some significant market share. In many network economies, the winner takes all for the very good reason that Metcalfe's law applies. The network is worth more the more nodes it has, and therefore there is a natural tendency for a monopoly to form. So I'm something of a skeptic on antitrust. Could there be regulatory improvements? Definitely. Should we rethink the mid-1990s exemptions that essentially treat the technology companies as if they're not content publishers? Yeah, definitely. That should be changed. We need a level playing field, and we need to treat this platform, which I'm currently addressing you on, as a content publisher. Sorry, Mark. Another question. There's one here that's come in. Let me see. I'm seeing a lot of China questions, but I think we should change the subject. Oh, here's a question from Andre Salas. Mr. Ferguson, please tell us your expectations about Brazil. I've just been to Brazil quite recently, had a very interesting trip, and came away thinking that this year's Brazilian election is going to be very interesting indeed, not least because it will be the first election where I think social networks are going to play a really big role. Of course, we don't know if one of the leading politicians in Brazil, Lula, is going to be allowed to run because of legal action. But one way or another, there could be some surprises in that election. I've been very struck by the amount of traction that this man Bolsonaro is getting on social media. He has a lot of followers on Facebook and on Twitter. He's the hard right candidate, the man who, in a whole host of politically incorrect statements, has even defended the period of military rule in Brazil. So it's going to be a very, very interesting election. And I think the lesson we learned in 2016 in the English-speaking world is do not underestimate the importance of social media. Let's see, what else do we have? There's a question that's just come in. Will Scotland finally win this year's Six Nations? Roger Biber or Bieber? No. Some hope. I'm actually going to watch Scotland play England in a couple of weeks. I bought tickets in the enthusiastic expectation of success, and they collapsed in the face of Wales in the opening game. What a bad start to the season. Can we change the subject to something more cheerful than Scottish rugby? Brodie McDonald, Dr. Ferguson, what is one thing you secretly agree with Keynes on? I have spent a lot of my career thinking about the work of John Maynard Keynes, and I am certainly somebody who regards him as one of the towering intellects of the 20th century. Reading the general theory when I was an undergraduate was one of the great intellectual challenges of my youth. I've always agreed with Keynes's analysis of the hyperinflation in early 1920s Germany as something that would be profoundly damaging to German society. And that's probably where my interest in his work began, because Keynes played such an important role in the early 1920s in advising informally the German government on how to deal with the reparations burden that had been imposed under the Treaty of Versailles. What I most was impressed by as I read Keynes's work from that period was his genuine compassion for the defeated enemy, his compassion for the ordinary Germans whose lives were being turned upside down by the destruction of the currency. And it resonated with me because I'd grown up in 1970s Britain, didn't have hyperinflation, but had pretty high inflation. And even that double-digit inflation caused my family a lot of hardship. It was my introduction to economics at age 10. So yeah, it wasn't a secret agreement. I've always openly agreed with Keynes that the surest way to undermine capitalism is to debauch the currency. Keynes attributed that phrase to Lenin, probably wrongly. I suspect that it was what he thought himself. Let's see. Anthony Walsh has a Brexit question. Is no deal with the EU better than a bad deal? No deal with the EU would be a very disruptive outcome for the Brexit negotiations, because I think it would potentially bring a substantial part of Britain's trade and conceivably even air transport to a halt. It's very difficult to have a no-deal outcome without a really big economic shock for the UK. And I think what's gradually emerging in the UK is that this divorce does not have an easy outcome. The most likely outcome is a transitional agreement that essentially leaves the EU, to all intents and purposes, under EU rules without representation in Brussels. And after that transition, it's very hard for me to imagine the UK not retaining at least some Swiss-like relationship to the EU. The interesting development in Brexit for me has been the beginning of measurable remorse in the polls, by which I mean we're beginning to see a different answer to the question that was posed in 2016 in the referendum. Sentiment, I think, is changing, and it's increasingly clear that the hardline Brexiteers in the Conservative Party are, in a sense, between a rock and a hard place, because if they are far too confrontational towards the compromise that seems to be emerging under Theresa May's leadership, they risk overthrowing the government, causing a general election and bringing Jeremy Corbyn potentially to power. Another odd thing that's happened in the UK lately is the Conservatives have done rather better in opinion polls, which is very surprising if you just follow the coverage of British politics in the British media, where it's generally agreed that Theresa May is a dead woman walking. She's doing surprisingly well in the polls for a dead woman. That's probably enough Brexit for now. Questions pouring in so fast that I can hardly read them. I'm trying to think where to go from here. Let's take a look. Maybe it's time to change tack. I'm not seeing new territory. We definitely aren't going back to Bitcoin. Oh, but Alex Park has a question about globalization. What are your thoughts on the anti-globalization movement occurring all across the world? Is there potential it can cause another crisis like the Great Depression? What is interesting about anti-globalization is that it used to be a left-wing cause, and it's increasingly become a right-wing cause as well. It's not that long ago that meetings of the G8 would be disrupted by anti-globalization protesters. It's not that long ago that anti-globalization protesters would disrupt IMF and World Bank meetings. But in the recent past, globalism became a dirty word on the right. And what seems to me especially striking is the way in which not only Donald Trump's campaign, but also the Brexit campaign harnessed a right-wing anti-globalization mood. And this was different from the left's anti-globalization because it emphasized not only the issue of trade. Fair trade is one of these slogans, which is code for not free trade, but it was also about immigration. And, one that needs to think about globalization as being in multiple dimensions. It's not just about trade, it's also about migration, and it's about capital flows. And anti-globalization has tended to focus on one or more of those. The anti-globalization of the left tended to emphasize the capital flows, arguing that lending to developing countries was often punitive, and the anti-globalization of the right tends to focus on migration. I think that in some ways globalization overshot, and I think it's not surprising that a backlash came along, because really the volumes of migration, the volumes of capital crossing borders, and indeed the amount of trade reached historically high levels. We haven't really seen anything quite like this since the late 19th, early 20th centuries by some measures. And it wasn't surprising that people on the left and on the right essentially began to say enough is enough. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is more a taming of globalization, a dialing back of it rather than its complete collapse. You asked, could there be a crisis like the Great Depression? Well, the answer to that question is there nearly was one, but it wasn't caused by anti-globalization protests. It was caused by the global financial system very nearly collapsing in 2008, 2009. We nearly had a Great Depression. If it hadn't been for a combination of incredibly innovative and expansionary monetary policy and something similar in China, I think we would have had another Great Depression. So we dodged that bullet, and I'd be surprised if it got fired again anytime soon. Oh, Tom Lambeth has a question. Will there be an Anglo-Asian merger to preserve classical Western institutions that continue to be eroded by the minute in the West? Interesting question, Tom. I do argue in my book Civilization that there is something of a crisis of Western civilization. And in The Great Degeneration, a book that started out as BBC Reith Lectures, I tried to say what the problems were, mostly internal problems of public finance, of deteriorating legal norms, of a crisis in education. And I do think that the way to fix the problems of Western institutions is essentially a question for Western politics. And I'd see not so much an Anglo-Asian merger as the way forward, more an increasing differentiation between an Anglo-American model in which the individual's liberty remains of central concern, and an East Asian model, a Chinese model to be precise, in which that is not the priority, and social order and social harmony count for much more. I am running out of time, much as I'm enjoying this discussion with you, and so I'm going to take a couple more questions very quickly before I go and collect my 6-year-old son. Arthur Hutchinson asks, Dr. Ferguson, what are you currently reading, and what have you recently finished? I am in the midst of Amy Chewer's new book, Political Tribes, which echoes a recent essay by Andrew Sullivan about the tribalism that has come to characterize our polarized politics. In The Square and the Tower, I talk about polarization as something that the network platforms have somewhat unwittingly exacerbated. So this is a subject dear to my heart. And as I'm reading Amy Chewer's book, I'm wrestling with the question, Is tribe the right word? Because I'm not sure it is. Maybe because in our different ways, my wife and I come from tribal societies. There's still the memory of clan conflict in Scotland. You still have to watch who you reveal the name Campbell to in Glencoe, and of course in Somalia, where my wife Ayan comes from. Tribes matter a huge amount, and I don't know that we're dealing with tribes in modern America. These great ideological blocks that we see, liberals on one side, conservatives on the other, aren't tribes because they don't really ask that much of their followers. Whereas tribes are like large families, and they make greater demands than I think our modern politics does. So that's the thing that I'm reading at the moment, and that's because I have to write a review on Monday. There's just time to ask one more to answer one more question. Well, I'll do two. Is the Eurozone malaise over? Well, it's in abeyance. It's in remission. The Eurozone has not been meaningfully reformed, in my view. There have been some changes since the crisis, but we're a far cry from the kind of large-scale institutional reform that the French president, Emmanuel Macron, would like to see. And that's partly because the Germans can't figure out who is going to be in their next government. Even now, it's not clear that there's going to be a great coalition. Social Democrat members might vote against it. Whoever ends up calling the shots in Germany is unlikely to go all the way down the Macron road. I'm going to guess that minimal reforms happen. They relabel an institution here, they tweak a regulation there, but I don't think the system's going to be that different. And so further down the line, I can imagine a scenario in which at least something of what we saw in 2011, 12, 13 happens again, because you still have a monetary union without any meaningful fiscal integration and relatively little labor mobility, and that is not a stable combination. Stevie Mack asks a personal question, which I don't mind answering. He asks, how is Ayan? My wife, Ayan Hirsi Ali, is very well indeed, but she will not be too pleased if I am late to pick up our son. And so I am now going to thank everybody for questions, seek the forgiveness of those whose questions I didn't have time to answer, and go off and be a good dad. Thanks everybody for initiating me into a solo Facebook Live exchange. I hope it won't be the last. So, signing off.